Good morning, everyone. We're here and ready to start on a Thursday morning. Here we go. Just letting people know, I may have to just bolt for a minute. My wife's waiting for a laptop to get delivered courtesy of Amazon to our front door. So don't like leaving those things laying around, especially when it says, computer. So want to make sure we get that in the house as quickly as possible. So a couple of, actually one change for today is the order of the presentations. Maxwell very graciously has allowed us to let him do his presentation for this week with a scheduling conflict otherwise. So hopefully we'll be seeing a few more folks coming in. And Maxwell, you'll be presenting your discussion on landscapes and architecture, which I think segues very nicely in this kind of transitional phase that we're in, where the SI sort of moves slightly away from the original interest of architecture, urban design, and poetry, and they sort of over time radicalize. And of course, part of it is through this interaction with the SB folks, socialism or barbarie. And so what we're going to do here is take sort of one last look at that earlier era where the way I see it is as a symbolist poet would look at something and it would represent a primordial idea. In this case, it would be beauty. And they see that image doesn't reconcile with this idea with a capital I of beauty. And therein starts this sort of rethinking of the world that they live in. So what Maxwell will present for us is sort of some of these thoughts that start actually quite early, even with the Letterist International, because the people that come together to constitute the SI are already thinking this way. This is one of the reasons why Debord gets along with him so well, is they are already presenting ideas that are very similar to what Debord is already thinking. Oh, Emily just came in. And so what we get now is a kind of a meeting of minds, and these initial thoughts pursue urban design, architecture, the hatred of high modernism, Le Corbusier, and so on. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and we can compare that to the readings we've had for this week, where there is an increased radicalization in terms of the SI as they move away from architecture and art and culture and become this much more radical revolutionary group that is more concerned with theory and implementing theory into some form of practice. Now, as you saw in the readings, especially the ones from the Real Split, there is this perennial problem, right, of taking theory and transforming it into practice without at the same time not getting that middle group of, what do you want to call them, the vanguard of the proletariat, like Lenin, or you wish to call them some sort of bureaucratic sort of in-between group that then disseminates information, disseminates practices. This was always the problem with Debord, is there was always that second layer. There was always the theory and the practice, and how do we do this in such a way that those that are practicing revolution truly understand what's going on, as opposed to just simply picking up a book. This is a problem that faced the SI, and I think it will face virtually any revolutionary group that tries to theorize their position. At one point, there will be individuals that seem to get a better grasp of the theoretical part of it. They end up, whether or not it's a vanguard or something else, but there's always this group that is set aside and are less likely to practice revolutionary actions, but will sit and theorize. That's what split the SB apart, and eventually that's what split the SI apart. So something to keep in mind. But I think now we've got just about everyone. So what I'd like to do is basically hand the floor to Maxwell to present his work in progress. We'll do the same thing, Maxwell, if you don't mind, if we kind of interject periodically, and then we can sort of generate discussion from the ideas that you raise, and there are quite a few of them. And then whatever time is left at the end, we'll go through some of the readings, because I think I might have top-loaded this class with a lot of stuff. And so if you take a couple of weeks to sort of digest it all, that's perfectly fine, because we still have at least, I think another almost month to sort of go through this material. And we are in this kind of transitional phase at this point, right? This more of a concern with revolutionary theory rather than derive and psychogeography. It is important, but it is something that the SI eventually set aside. And I think some of you that may have had some experience with the SI may have come to it from these practices that are really, when we look at it chronologically, it may have been associated more with the Letterist International than they were with the SI in their totality. In the early few years, absolutely concerned with it, but by the early 60s, in this interaction with the SB group, something clicked, right? So something changed, and they radicalized very quickly after that. Okay, so enough said for me. I'd like to pass over the digital floor to Maxwell to do his presentation, and we'll just sit and listen. And by all means, if you have questions, raise your hand, or I think there's a little hand thing in the chat room or something, and then we'll go from there. So Maxwell, please go ahead.
Thank you. Do you have a Jeff Koons picture in the background? Yeah. I'm looking at the picture on to my right, to your left. It looks like a Jeff Koons still. You're muted.
Sorry, the quick story behind this poster was when I was in Montreal in 1986, 87, this was a film festival, not the major one, but kind of like for all the debris and people that couldn't get into the big festival, they go and present there. But I mean, people like Vim vendors would present there. And this poster was actually considered offensive because it was, if you were to translate the term, it says, we're speaking film, where there are pieces of film that are coming out of the woman's mouth and into the other woman's mouth, and people were very offended. I happen to know the guy that ran it was a good friend of mine. He says, we might have to ban these. And before he finished the sentence, I had already taken the poster off the wall. I said, I got to go now. So yeah, I don't know if they're still going, but it's a poster from, yes, October of 1985. That's how long ago it was. So I happened to be lucky enough to be there, and it was banned. So as soon as that happened, everybody wanted a copy of it. But it isn't rude. It just means on parle le cinéma, right? We're speaking film, and literally strips of film are coming out of their mouth. Okay, but yeah, Jeff Koons, that would have cost me many, many dineros. I can't afford that. Anyway, go right ahead.
Sure. So I feel like never supposed to start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to start this one with a caveat that I have two one-year-old cats that refuse to let me sleep. So if I'm moving a little slowly today, that's why. I have a PowerPoint too. If you could enable screen share or make me a co-host.
You
Okay.
got 2 cats?
Sorry?
You have 2 new cats?
Yeah, Penguin and Goose.
Oh my God.
They're
Wow.
very, very difficult creatures.
If they come by, can we say hi?
They're not here. I'm in a different place.
Okay.
But I will show you a quick picture because I feel like now that I've mentioned cats, I need to show cats, and then we'll move on.
We have 3 wandering around through this house, but they're all asleep by this point.
Yeah, so there we've got Penguin and Goose looking decent and not as nearly mischievous as they really are.
It's amazing.
So I have, just by the way that I do these things, I have a PowerPoint, mostly because I'm a pictures kind of person. I think through pictures primarily, so I kind of need them to work through this. As Ed said, you can interject, but I probably won't see you, so just shout out into the ether and we'll go from there. So originally my short paper was on landscape and trying to understand where the art object goes in the SI's practice and some of the implications attached to that. Things have sort of meandered a bit since then, and that was already a fairly pared down version of the things I was navigating. So since we're kind of more informally talking about things in this class, I thought I'd just kind of throw the like patchwork of stuff that's on my plate, and we can ignore or navigate it as we want.
Mm-hmm.
What I've ended up with as a title, which is just part of my working method, is I come up with a title and then try and figure out what the hell it means, is Entertaining Closed Landscapes, the Psychogravitation of Constance New Babylon. Rather than explaining that, I'll just do the presentation and hopefully that'll make sense at the end of this. By way of one last little preamble, before I get into the real material. I wanted to show a bit of my working method to make sense of everything. These 3 books kind of serve as the foundational stones to the rest of my theory house, if you will. The one on the left doesn't directly figure into the project, but is important to understand, or I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from, because it was something I was reading when I entered into this class. The Cloud Glass or the Cloud Mirror, or the Cloud Glass by Arnaud Millet, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is a book that looks at the cloud glass or cloud mirror, also known as the black mirror, which is, I mean, the whole book tries to explain what this object is, but as a shorthand, it's a tool that, a reflective convex tool that can fit generally in the palm of your hand, or it's carryable. And it's generally used by landscape painters to help frame the landscape, help them with perspective because of the slight curvature of the surface, and help them find tonal variations in the landscape. The reason why I wanted to bring this up, aside from just being on my mind, is that it identifies sort of like 3 key areas for me. One aspect is it's an optical device. Another aspect is that it's an artistic tool. And the third one is that it's deeply ingrained with narrative, cultural narrative. The black mirror, like all mirrors, tend to be related to divination and some kind of occult practice. Obviously, it's related to illusion, copies, repetition, and all of that goodness or badness, depending on how you look at it. But the black mirror in particular emphasizes the occult, mostly just because it's black. And it actually disappeared from the archival record for the most part around the 18th and 19th century, which is why this guy's so interested in the object and why he writes the book. But the fact that stories about the black mirror being, quote, the devil's ass, or that like black hole, that narcissistic black hole that we look into, it was so offensive to some curators, even in the 20th century, that they refused to acknowledge its presence in their archives. So the weight of that narrative and how it structures meaning around these objects, I find really fascinating. The second book, Good Entertainment, A Deconstruction of the Western Passion Narrative by Byung-Chul Han, is really central to what I'll be talking about. In essence, what Han's looking at is he's trying to characterize a certain trajectory in Western culture he calls the passion narrative, which as a shorthand, we can just think of as seriousness. It comes in terms of like religious fervor, artistic production, maybe like political engagement, philosophy, basically any kind of very serious practice. And Han wants to juxtapose this against entertainment and more diffusely pleasure. I will get into defining what entertainment is because I like really solid objects, but the essence of Han's argument is that entertainment is this very confusing and fuzzily defined concept. It doesn't really fit into anything, but it poses very serious problems for our contemporary age, and I think it knits in quite nicely to the society of the spectacle, which we can talk about as we go. And then this last book on the right, Constance New Babylon, The Hyperarchitecture of Desire by Mark Wigley, is something I came to through this class, through looking at the SI as I was trying to find some sort of object to latch onto and think about. So specifically, I grabbed onto New Babylon, and part of this presentation is going to be trying to understand this term desire in relationship to it. It seems like desire and passion are very much terms that apply to the SI. And I think part of that can be explained because they want to perform revolution, which we'll later get into. Entertainment is more of a normative stabilizing force. Of course, I already mentioned some of this in response to Chris's presentation. So if I'm a bit repetitive, I apologize for that. But I want to put pressure on this idea of desire in relationship to New Babylon and in relationship to revolution isn't the right word, but maybe crucial practices for us today, artistic creative practices. I'm not sure that this is the right way to go forward with it, and it might place the SI more firmly in the past for us than otherwise, but as a very important, not stepping stone, I'm not really sure, plateau, like leading up, I'm not really sure what the word is I want there, but hopefully you'll see what I mean. So by way of introduction to the New Babylon, I've chosen these two sketches by Constant rather than showing pictures of his models, of which there are many and many photographs of. We'll show some later. But I think the drawings better capture this sort of playful essence of the New Babylonian space as these modular, adjustable spaces where individuals' willpower and desires are supposed to really clash and conflict with each other. As you can see from the sketches, and the bottom one is one of the more refined versions of what I found, they're very ill-defined. They tend to be represented in quite transparent states, which is also a reason why I haven't shown the models. They tend to be made with plexiglass to expose the many layered interiors, which push them more toward artistic, like sculptural objects. And in fact, Constant was actually criticized by other architects of the time for having models that were too beautiful. They felt that models were supposed to be disposable objects. And Constant, as an artist first, as a painter first, clearly didn't agree. But in these drawings anyway, especially the top one, I couldn't really tell you what's going on, though I'm guessing it's a staircase. And it's this kind of ambiguity that I want to lean on. I also think it's really funny that he likes ladders as a way to navigate multi-layered structures, which just seems like one of the most ableist things you could possibly do and would no longer be appropriate. But it was his thing. So New Babylon was an architectural vision. It was never actually made. It was multi-leveled, it was modular, and it was suspended as a concept. And it was supposed to be a manifestation of the SI's thoughts on unitary urbanism and the dérivé as a way to bring together social practices and theories in material space, and then perpetually recreate these spaces as curious and exciting, unknown adventures. You could travel through the same coordinates, but they could be radically different because of how people have engaged with them. So Wigley, I think, succinctly describes this architectural space as all paths become detours, which is just very lovely for the things that we've been studying.
Maxwell, in the Mark Wigley book, did you find anything referring to Constant's interest in, for example, Marcel Duchamp? Because when I look at towers, I'm thinking of Nude Descending the Staircase, which again, we have staircases and ladders, which are devices to move us from one space to another, vertically, of course. And was there any relationship to early Dadaist paintings such as that one and some of the initial ideas that he was presenting? Because this would have been probably about the early to mid 50s when Constant was working.
So Constant started on this project. I should mention this actually, so thanks. New Babylon was a 15-year long project. I think it was 1956 to 74, give or take a year. Mm-hmm. So Duchamp was having a resurgence in the 60s. He would have just been coming around in the art scene as a popular figure at this time. Mm-hmm. These sketches are probably from the 60s. And Constant first makes this public in 1960 at a museum that starts with S and I'm afraid to pronounce, and I can't think of completely off the top of my head.
Was this one of the museums in Holland?
Yes.
Holland or Belgium, although Dutch people would slap me for saying that, they're the same, but he was associated, I think more so in Belgium than he was in Holland. But yeah, I think I know the one you mean. It's Scots something.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it was museum level exposure, not some random hole in the wall is the more important part of that. But in terms of Duchamp, I didn't find anything explicit. He's obviously floating in the background, and Constant does make these sculptures that are weirdly Duchamp specific. He's clearly cut apart the spokes of a wheel and rearranged it in this sort of carousel, like architectural space. It looks like something out of Mad Max, but
and it seems to vibrate and move. I mean, as much as that's one of the ideas that informs both Constant and Asger Jorn, this notion of mobility and mutability. And I see that here there's at least an attempt on a two-dimensional surface to create that same sort of movement, whether you want to call them wiggle lines or something else. The notion that this image tries to capture the notion of mutability. And I was just thinking here, one of the pieces, I think I might have mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. It was a review in Potlash, which was the journal that the Letterist International were putting out. And this would have been 1954. This one had come out in November. And it was a review of Asger Jorn's book. And they just took some passages. And one of the passages is functional realists don't understand that human beings are in a constant state of movement, constant state of mutation, dynamic conception of forms. All human forms are always in a state of continual transformation. So again, this sort of meeting of minds of Constant and Jorn, looking at the world in a very similar way at the same time, whether it was the zeitgeist or whether it was something else, the notion that human forms are always in a state of continual transformation. I see in Constant's work an attempt to capture that, however fleetingly, but certainly in these drawings. I think you were correct in choosing the drawings more so than the finished work. We get to see the, I guess maybe the intent more clearly in these drawings.
Yeah, that's well said. I'm just going to make a note before I forget.
So if you want to look at it, it's again, these are probably available now. Can you read French?
Me?
Yeah.
Like 2 years ago, I would have said yes.
Okay, at least you don't have to have a conversation with anyone. But if you look at Potlash number 15, 22nd of December, 1954, and it's an article called An Architecture of Life is what the article is called. Now, you can, like I do with German stuff, you can just cut and paste a thing into Google Translate and get the phrase or get the passages. But this is one that's quite early on, these same ideas. Interestingly enough, one from Scandinavian country, from Denmark, and someone from Belgium, thinking along the same lines. It's that, and to me in itself, is quite remarkable. But it shows that there was a very deep response to the ugliness of high modernism. And we have two different, well, Constant, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think was ever an architect, was he? He was primarily a painter.
Yeah, I can't remember if I get to this later or if I cut it out. But it is really interesting to me, and it's relevant to something I'll bring up in a bit, that Constant was never a formally trained architect. He was technically an amateur. And that seems peculiar because some of the literature on him will refer to how, like with Cobra, he was a painter and then he returns to being an architect. And then others will just bluntly say that he was never formally trained and just became an architect. So I'm not sure which one it is, though I suspect, given the time period, maybe he was trained as a draftsman, and that through that got into painting rather than architecture. So it's kind of a halfway point. He started halfway, went in one direction, then veered around to another one. But you're right.
Because like I think, for example, of an artist that goes to art school and one goes into fine art, the other into commercial art, right? They still have the same grounding.
Totally. So I'll go back to wherever I was. I just wanted to cover some more details about New Babylon as a thing, which I think Wigley captures in this quote. He says, "The old ground-based cities with their static organization have been abandoned as an outmoded technology." This is pretty crucial that in a piece that's not really captured in these drawings, which is New Babylon was a suspended city above the cities that we currently live in, above ground level, above landscapes. And it's quite a sci-fi kind of experience, very Blade Runner-y. I always think of that scene from, what's that movie with Keanu Reeves, the mnemonic,
Johnny
John?
Mnemonic.
Johnny Mnemonic, yeah. That
Not
moment
one of his
where-
best.
yeah, before he meets the dolphin. If for anyone who's seen this movie, there's like this suspended bridge, I think. Anyway, it has that kind of aesthetic. Doesn't matter. Point is, so the buildings are floating or suspended above everything else. There's a lot of very spectacular qualities to this architecture, which interestingly is not what architects didn't like about his projects, and isn't really the resistance to these projects having not been made or been made, why they weren't made. It was his complete abolishment of private space that they didn't like, which I think I will also be bringing up later, just constantly pushing things back to the end of the presentation. So just to carry on with Wigley's quote, a few isolated sectors of this new city are built and progressively take over, multiplying into an ever-growing network that has no limits, no exterior, a camp for nomads on a planetary scale. The endless space of daily life is completely enclosed. There's a few important things in that, that there's no limits on this, and that it's an endless space I found very confusing for a long time, and was very central to my short paper. I realized that the endless space is because of its modular and adjustable changing space. It's endlessly renewed, but it's not literally endless space, which is what I was looking for some reason. It's also important to get the scale of this. He is building and showing models for a building or maybe city block size, but the project New Babylon is really a planetary, all-encompassing sort of network, and it's quite difficult to actually imagine this being in place in a way that's not just straight up sci-fi. So Constant stands in opposition to a lot of the SI figures for an important reason that made him resistant to joining the SI in the first place, and then also led to him resigning from the SI, which is in shorthand, he felt that the artists were basically too arrogant and too narcissistic and too self-centered in their approaches to really make the changes they were claiming. And I think this is captured when he says in New Babylon 10 years on, which I don't actually know when it's written, but I'm going to guess it's in the 70s. Says, unlike other situationists, I realized straight away that the theory of unitary urbanism was not primarily concerned with microstructures or ambiances. On the contrary, these depend largely on the macrostructure, and the elaboration of the extremely sketchy idea of unitary urbanism was therefore inextricably bound up with a critique of city planning. This is why it's so important to understand that this is really a global scale project, that when he says macrostructure, he means it very seriously. He doesn't want to follow in the footsteps of just wandering around a prefabricated city. He wants to, somewhat ironically or misleadingly, from the ground up, rebuild what it means to be human. And as I say this, I realize it would actually be very interesting to read New Babylon through Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, which I won't do. And I'm just going to move on to Ivan Chechkov's formulary for a new urbanism. This quote is where I got the title from my short paper, Closed Landscapes, when he says, "We move within closed landscapes whose landmarks constantly draw us toward the past." This is interesting to me, one, because the idea of a closed landscape seems like another misdirection. It seems like a misnomer. It's not, for reasons I'll say in the next slide. But it's evocative nonetheless. And this idea that there's landmarks that from the past that draw us around the city, very psychogeographical, very intimately related to the dérivé, if not unavoidably. And I've included this photograph from Eugene Adget, just because his photography really expresses what it's like to be in the city, especially just before the SI. These very urban, modern spaces that can be quite isolating and have some life in their own right. They have a certain kind of character and quality that I think after Haussmann, after a lot of the plate, glass, and steel structures that we're more used to today, we sort of lose sense of this patchy plaster work and slanted roads, cobblestone, and the like.
One thing that I found really interesting with Cheshkov's statement is this notion that the space is imbued with time, in the sense that the temporal relationship that we have, we're in a closed landscape today, but everything reminds us of what has been. And with the SI, certainly preoccupied with the future, right? Everything seems to move towards, we will do this, we will build this, and that utopian impulse, to be reminded constantly of what has been. And this is a city full of plaques. There's a plaque around every single corner of some great event. It's like, wow, I know we're on the cusp of postmodernism and everything's relative and everything's been done and it's, we're exhausted. That to me is another statement that leads towards that postmodern view of, it's all been done before. The fact that every landscape or every street corner that we turn around to, yet another plaque to remind us that someone else got here first to do something better. And these little nuggets all along the way, that particular, in fact, that whole essay by Cheshkov, I love. I know it's not specifically the SI, and he did work very briefly with them, but really captures in a poetic sense how time is really seeping into these landscapes to the degree where they're closed. They're closed to possibilities, right? They're closed to potentialities. It's a done deal. And so how do you get out of that? And of course, what they do is to radicalize more and more visions of a future and then streamline everything towards a political, political agenda rather than something that is architectural or cultural. I just want to throw that in because Cheshkov's work here is particularly beautiful and poetic, and the way he describes, that temporal quality of space.
Yeah, Cheshkov really inspired me to do pretty much everything I've done for this course and in this course. That first reading by him was deeply influential.
Mm-hmm.
And you're actually getting ahead of me in terms of time. So no, that's good. We're on the same page here.
All right.
So because I was curious about landscapes, I went to Rebecca Solnit's book, As Eve Said to the Serpent, which is really just an absolutely wonderful text. And in it, she describes landscape as a kind of scenery. Scenery is stage decoration, and stage decorations are static backdrops for a human drama. This was not how I was thinking of landscape in my short paper, but is very much how I'm thinking of it now. Mm-hmm. I've included Andrew Waite's painting because it's just one of the most depressing and forlorn paintings I've ever seen. I think it really captures what Solnit's getting at. There we go. So Solnit wants to claim or argue exactly what you're saying, Ed, that landscape is often thought in terms of space, but its deepest theme is time. Two ways that she characterizes this is in this sort of psychotemporal register is Arcadianism and Utopianism. Arcadianism is related to the pastoral, to the land as nature, which is literally this past place. It has this cyclical relationship to time, an eternal return, this always going back to, and I almost want to talk about it as cultivation, which seems very pastoral appropriate. And then on the other hand, we have utopianism, this idyllic construction, literally no place, and very intimately attached to that Hegelian history, that linear progress of culture heading towards something.
Apparently absolute freedom.
Yeah. I can't start talking about that or we will never finish this presentation.
No, we'll leave it there.
That is a very deep theme for Han as well. That's very exciting and very alluring. Mm-hmm. So Solnit wants to cast nature as an ideal, a goal that emerges in postmodernity. And this, I think, is pretty significant with the SI because it's right on that knife's edge between the two of modernity and postmodernity, pushing a lot of what I find in Solnit, which I think is the next slide, always slightly ahead of myself here. So nature as an ideal is in contrast to history's nostalgic relation to nature, that pastoral quality. And this goes all the way back to Plato's cave, that almost quasi-architectural space, that artifice that is then, the subject's then dragged out of that architectural space, that almost utopic, maybe dystopic space, into natural light, and then they're blinded and they say hell no and go back. Okay, I lost my train of thought there, but modernism is aimed at urbanism and development. That's very much in the utopian train, and that linear development, that linear sense of time, moving towards a specific thing, and as he said, that freedom. And Solnit wants to characterize this shift that I want to put place in the SI, more or less, from that modernist drive towards urbanism, which obviously the SI is holding on to more contemporary versions of art, such as land art, where the landscape is not just scenery, it's not just backdrop, but it's a kind of system. It's something that we're situated within, that we're part of, that we engage with. And this is something that Jonathan Crary will talk about in response to Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle. He talks about the spectator versus the observer. And the spectator is this passive onlooker. The observer is aware of their limitations and possibilities. They're embedded in these systems. So I've just found that to be a very useful way of thinking about these things. And it's fascinating for me as an artist to try and understand that contemporary art means being part of something, not just being outside of it and looking in on it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, shoot, Judith.
Okay, I don't know if maybe this is what you're gonna get at, but it sounded like in the previous slide, with the way you were using Rebecca Solnit to bring just the concept of nature into the picture. It sounds like in her theory, so nature emerges in postmodernism, and that's in stark contrast to some abstract historical time in which we felt we had to turn away from nature. So I'm just wondering, are you positioning the SI, because maybe I would, as like a middle stage? Yeah, when we think so much about their obsession and preoccupation with urbanism, the way that architect, Constant What's-His-Face, was drawing his models with no landscapes at all in the vision, like nature and landscape have been totally disappeared from the utopian vision, and the vision seems purely urban. But this is not, I don't think it's the same kind of nature as in Rebecca Solnit's historical nostalgic relationship when we were turning away from it. So what is this like middle phase of the SI? What kind of utopian relationship to nature do they have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the SI are in many ways modernist. Just being a part of the avant-garde is enough to convince me of that. And I think their pivotal position between this modernist urbanism and more contemporary concerns with nature via Solnit is, and I think this is especially seen in Constant, but it's also more generally in psychogeography and the dérivé, that these are practices that end up in bringing us into things. It situates us in that system, that process, and it's not an object-subject relation as strictly. So I see that as a transitional moment. The major difference for Solnit is in modernism and before, nature was treated as an object, something for the subject, for the artist or viewer to look at and use. Whereas in contemporary art, specifically land art, but just more in general, being aware of environmental impacts, being aware of politics, art and activism, this sort of engagement where you're in the thick of it instead of a bystander. So I really see that shift happening in the SI. Even though they're still urban, they are systemic as opposed to object-based, if that makes sense. Thanks for the question. That was really good. So I probably should have just been lingering on this slide because I wanted to show that sort of quality with these structures, these models, where they are partially like, they're lifted out of the landscape. They're not embedded in it, which I think is significant. They sit on top of it and kind of look down at it. It's still very much involved in that urbanism, though there's something really fascinating about this split between nature and urbanism that's emphasized in New Babylon that I don't see in very many other structures. This quote is too long for me to just remember what I was trying to get at with it. So I'll just read it to you. When the natural world ceases to be perceived as the scenery out there and becomes, so this is more an answer to Judith's question. When the natural world ceases to be perceived as the scenery out there and becomes the systems and substances all around, this is from SoulNet, by the way, we've moved from a mechanical to an ecological worldview, one that is implicit in many installations dealing with substance. In concentrating on substance rather than form as the bearer of meaning, artists assert the decisive significance of substance rather than regarding it as neutral matter that takes on meaning as it is given form. The very notion of giving meaning to something is premised on a cosmology in which things don't have it yet, in which form is it, in which form is it, content as spirit is to matter, when men to women, God to nature. This was a significant quote for me because it does that. It's concerned with this moving into systems rather than this object-subject relation and treating things as already having inherent meaning as part of systems. They have a place in that system and a reason to be. They're affected by other things related to it, very much like New Babylon structure, where you do have the structure itself, but there's no inherent meaning to it. It's always imbued with whoever happened to move through it last and affect it. It's always a systemic relation. So SoulNet's question or quote led me to think about where is meaning in New Babylon. It's very much in that modular, adjustable, playful space. On the right here, we have a picture of Constant looking at one of his models, a more standard version of the model. And in the background, we actually see some of those bicycle wheel images that I was talking about earlier in response to Duchamp. The one on the far right in the top corner is what I was actually thinking about. On the left, we have a model that I find very peculiar and was my main focus for a lot of this, which has now dropped out, but it's called the spatiovore or space eater. It's peculiar because it's one of the few curved objects that exist in New Babylon. It's one of the more closed spaces, and I'm not entirely sure how it would fit into the rest of his architectural system. To me, it looks like an amphitheater or some sort of entertainment space. But specifically, I wanted to show it because the name spatiovore, space eater, it's not literally talking about space, it's talking about property, that these structures eat private property, eat ownership, and create meaning out of this supposed tension and creativity that its citizens would walk around just like producing whatever they feel that space needs to be. And that supposedly does create meaning, or at least that's what I assume Constant's getting at, though I really want to put pressure on that because to me, it's not meaningful, it's possibilities, but possibilities in themselves don't constitute true meaning. This sort of critique comes out of Mark Wigley's book where he's claiming that New Babylon is a city of desires. This heterogeneous desires collide and generate new spaces. That's the creative forces that he's Wigley and Constant are both concerned with. But I want to propose that New Babylon is actually a city of entertainment. That's really my thesis for all of this, and it's all been leading up to that moment. So now we're going to get into more of the external stuff. Are there any questions about that? Because I'm just about to like totally shift registers here.
I was going to ask you one brief question. If you had gone back to look at a really early essay, this again under the pre-SI text in Nab's book, Proposals for Rationally Improving the City of Paris, and you were talking about how you've got a closed, inert, static landscape versus a landscape that you can interact with. And certainly one of the earliest ideas that are presented by 1955, October of 1955, when these were still the Letters International, the various ideas they had about changing the landscapes, or at least allowing individuals to change the landscape, in such as, you know, something as simple as allowing the metro to run later. Another one about, you know, allowing us the possibility of turning on and off a street light, which sounds really strange, but you're interacting with that closed space. You are changing it ever so slightly. And so this, again, early ideas. Now, some of the more severe ones: cemeteries should be eliminated, museums should be abolished. Everyone, and this is my favorite, everyone should have free access to the prisons. The very notion of a prison. We should have free access. I mean, thought bomb. Yeah, what does a prison do? Well, it of course incarcerates people. And we should have free access to them. Utterly defeating the purpose of that building in the first place. Well, we need more doors, right? We need to give everyone a key. What happens? It completely deflates the very reason for that building to exist in the first place. So there are times clever, other times kind of a really sustained idea that I think one of the passages in that essay talks about building bridges that connect roofs, like the rooftops, which I keep hoping for. I haven't seen it really in very many cities, but just the notion of all this wasted landscape that happens to be on a higher level, and it becomes a different place for people to interact and communicate because it's free of traffic, right? It's free of car traffic, which is something that really concerned the SI, especially when they looked at the way in which cities were being revamped to simply allow more car traffic, right? The easier, the more, expediting goods and services rather than expediting individuals from point A to B. So the idea of the streetlights, the idea of bridges, it really in the big picture compared to Constant are very minor, but they are still informed by that same spirit of, I want to be able to interact with my space, right? I want to be able to do something else with it. I just wanted to bring that up because some of these early ones really kind of deal more specifically with your topic, and then sort of abandoned by the early 60s. Judith, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'm curious to know how this is going to take a turn and veer into entertainment. So I'm not sure if like what I'm saying is going to be able to connect to that at all, but it's impossible to look at this example of Constant What's-His-Face and not think of Moshe Safdie, and especially think of his early work. Like I remember going to a gallery somewhere where they were featuring all of his drafts and sketches and architectural plans from his utopian phase. So obviously like Habitat 67 and earlier. And there were so many intersections between the vision that he had for an urban space and the type of urban space that is New Babylon. Yeah, and it does, I guess it brings me back to that point about nature, because like now if you Google Habitat 67, which I just did, you get like Guardian articles about how it was a failed utopia and it's a failed project. And part of the failure is that the vision did not translate. So what it ended up looking like was a bunch of concrete boxes, but the utopian vision was this mobile, interactive, modular, endless space. And I think there's something really integral there about the lack of that vision translating, and like what the SI didn't explain, or what that utopian project like couldn't realize, because to the general public who lived in this space, who saw those concrete boxes that Moshe Safdie built, it didn't quite like move us into that utopia that he envisioned.
Yeah, Judith, you're touching on sort of my central concern, which is and the SI is very aware of this. Simply changing the material space does not cut it. You can't get that unitary urbanism. You can't get that sense of unification and common well-being or whatever just from making a building. It has to come from something much deeper, which is what led me to entertainment, which I'll explain more in a sense. Habitat 67, I think, is a really good example. Rather than rambling, maybe I'll just move on, and I think it'll address what you're talking about, unless there's other questions or anything anyone wants to bring up.
I was just going to say, in terms of segueing into the next part, the Habitat 67, that building, which I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, it's pretty cool. It looks pretty cool. And it was back in 1967 when I was 7, and our family went to Expo 67. And the segue is into the fact that Expo 67 was purely entertainment, and there were pavilions from around the world. Like, this was in Montreal. This is what made it so cool. The Canadian pavilion was an inverted pyramid, for example, and the US pavilion was this geodesic dome. So there was a lot of experimenting. But at the end of the day, when everybody went home and it was done, no one went back to live, right? They were just these really cool, interesting buildings. So to Judith's point, there is always that difficulty of translating the idea into the reality. And when the reality is, I'd like to build a mobile city floating in the air. Okay, where do we start? Is it overreaching? And then we kind of get halfway and say, well, how about we allow you some light switches on your street lights? There's that overreaching, and then something kind of in between, which, I mean, we can see now. We know that city planners are more and more concerned now with having green space, right? We hear the word green space, which every time I hear this terminology, I think of Constant, I think of the SI, because it was an antidote to high modernism, right? High modernism, if you don't know what that is, go to Keelan Finch in Toronto and look around. There probably is 3 square inches of green, and the rest of it is huge buildings crammed with people. So I still get a sense, I can understand where they were at back in the 50s, when this thing was like, or the architecture of the day, the style of the day. And suddenly this fantastic city that had all this charm and history in a good way now is being replaced by these just monolithic blocks that, as Chechkolov said, were more useful for prisons. So we have now kind of a meeting halfway, right? Here is that utopian vision. And well, we can get this far. Let's have rooftop gardens. Let's have some green space. Let's factor that in. Let's make sure that people can develop parks, which is an issue we have here even in London. There was the possibility that that Victoria Park was going to be developed for high rises, and somebody said no. Now, is that as far as it goes? Is that the practical aspects of these great ideas? I don't know, but certainly I wanted to just call attention to Habitat 67 was part of a larger thing of Expo 67 in Montreal, and some of the most amazing and coolest looking buildings I'd ever seen. I mean, I was impressed by anything at the age of 7, but I was going overboard, but still pretty cool to see. Again, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, you're reminding me, there's a lot of things that we could go into here, like Constant talks about the garden city, and I think so does Chechkolov. I do think they're literally speaking about garden, like natural spaces between buildings, but I think it also, the same concept applies to that high modernist, like virtually no greenery space. It's just these weird void spaces between buildings, and the SI's opposing interest of really condensing this to create more opportunities for various kinds of collision. The other thing, I know I had it in the presentation, but I think I stripped it, that this project is importantly not utopian for Constant. He's very clear, as we read it in Another City for Another Life, that what he's building this project out of is an understanding of contemporary materials, and to him it's completely a feasible project in terms of material. It's a necessary project in terms of social dynamics, that for fostering a good life and fostering a human life, we actually need to do this. So talking about all of these urban utopian projects, we also need to keep in mind that this project sort of runs a very strange threshold position between realistic application and utopian dreams.
Mm.
And I'm going to push ahead now. So to entertainment, also, no one can see the Zoom pieces of my screen, right? That's blocked out. I'm not obstructing the PowerPoint here.
No, no.
Okay, good, good, good. So entertainment for Hahn, he defines using Joachim Westerbarkes, who's a professor at Munich University, which I think just kind of nicely sort of ties up a number of things. Westerbarkes says that entertainment is communication light and non-compulsory participation without high expectations or rules. In that definition, I immediately see one of Constant's inspirations, which is Huizinga's Homo Ludens, man the player, or human the player, whatever. This idea of games and gamification is very deeply intertwined with the SI's practices, and it's something that becomes heavily critiqued in Hahn's book as a neoliberal process that just ends up putting us to work more. Hahn himself defines entertainment as an activity employed to fill free time. But this we should already be a little wary of, because in today's day and age, that's not strictly true. On the next page, after Hahn claims that's what entertainment is, he actually disagrees with himself, saying that entertainment is no longer contained within leisure. It's not these episodes that are dispersed between work and sleep, survival, and all of these other things. Instead, entertainment at present strains against all temporal and functional limitations. It is no longer episodic, but is instead becoming chronic. It no longer affects only free time, but time itself. I have a couple of quotes that I'm just going to read that I think explain this quite well, so we have a better grip on what that actually means. Apparently not yet. I was really building up towards that. It didn't work out. So I guess the time itself changing because of entertainment is influenced by work time becoming, in neoliberal terms, more of a passion project, something we're supposedly doing because we love these things. I hear this all the time from people that are specifically like a couple years younger than me, in a way that just makes me feel so ancient. It's a very different way of looking at work. This idea that we should always enjoy what we do, instead of what I think it's Bifo talks about work as this temporary death in Soul at Work, that we go off, we temporarily die to earn our wages, come home, and then have a good time, which Ed, you talked about a bunch of times. That sort of thinking seems to have been replaced by something else.
The way in which we would fight that is I would always bring in a book or a crossword or something else. And not that I was thinking, hey, I'm such an SI type character, but the notion of creating entertainment within that space that is otherwise dead, because you're doing literally the same thing over and over and over again. So you're sure, on the one hand, you can park your brain walking through the front door, but for some of us, me in particular, I never did that very well. I just would need to have something to occupy my mind. Physically, I knew what I was doing, but to break apart that dead space, that's what I would do. And as long as my job got done, they would just kind of look the other way. Said, I'm working on a project, leave me alone. And the work got done.
Totally. Just for personal example or anecdote as well, I worked retail for about 7 years, and my entertainment was often at the expense of my customers. And I was very explicit about it. And it made, for anyone who works retail, this might ring true, that there's a kind of the honesty that I was trapped there for X amount of time and they had become my entertainment to pass my time seemed to be appreciated about 90% of the time, which worked. I didn't have the luxury to sit down and read, mostly because there were cameras watching me, so on and so forth. But this idea that I was there against my will, and I was also there supposedly because I had fun. I worked in West 49, like a skate shop, so it's this weird halfway point. So I share that because I think it's halfway between that kind of factory work and more of this passion project labor that maybe we're supposed to be doing now as scholars, that we're really supposed to just love what we do and not get paid for it, or work endless hours, or whatever. So in this sort of context, sorry, Judith.
Oh, it's okay. Well, I just had a question. I was actually wondering for Ed, like if you had the sense, Ed, at your job, that other people also had the same kind of passion projects on the side.
There were some people that, I mean, as you can imagine, as a 19-year-old, I walk in and I start working in a factory. My own experience is, well, I saw the movie Metropolis, so I think these are a bunch of robots and, you know, unthinking. But hey, they were all people. And the more I got to know them, it seemed like people really used it. They used that job as a means to an end, right? Which I don't know, again, Maxwell, if that might segue into what you're talking about. If your attitude towards mindless drudgery, I mean, it paid well, but mindless drudgery of cooking cornflakes allowed you to, you know, design belt buckles or travel the world or do other things like I was doing, it makes it worthwhile. It still is drudgery, but yes, I was one of several different people, you know, that had other things going on. Now, depending on what it is, sometimes you can bring it to work with you. But yeah, there were several other people that had the same attitude of using the job as a means to an end, right? The end was something that gave you some satisfaction. And this was kind of the sacrifice you had to make. Certain jobs allowed for a bit more kind of, we'll call it spare time, quote unquote. But Maxwell, as you say, you know, having cameras on you, it's virtually impossible. For us, they just would walk by maybe twice a shift. You know, the food is still in the belt. Obviously, he's doing his job. But I was really lucky in being able to do that. But I wasn't the only one. It's just that I happened to be able to do things like bring a book, you know, and take notes simply because the job was there that I could do it. I put myself through school doing it. So that's how much spare time. Just if you can imagine this, it's a night shift. It's 3:30 in the morning, 4 a.m. The change room looks like a morgue. There's bodies everywhere. Everyone's asleep, and I'm busy dealing with Hegel, right? I'm busy reading through Phenomenology of Spirit, the Master-Slave Dialectic, going, yeah, this looks familiar, as I keep on writing. So as you can imagine, I finished my PhD working in a factory. Not normal, and no, it's not. And maybe that's not really a good quote unquote example, but that's the way in which I made that job a means to an end. Paid for my education. I finished with owing a lot less than if I had gone through that entire period, never working at all. But I wasn't the only one. Most people, though, had something of interest outside of work. But some of us were lucky enough to, like my friend that ended up, we started a band together. He would bring in his damn guitar. He was bringing a guitar. He worked in stores, which is where you go and get equipment. People wouldn't show up too often. He'd be sitting in the back playing the guitar. So yeah, you wonder why they closed us. We still got the job done, right? But yeah, that's where you start manipulating that spare time, work time, and you start playing with it. And it is a mobile. It is more, you know, depending on what's going on. Now, this is not every single day. There are some days when, as my friend would say, you're up to your ass in alligators, and you couldn't do that. But if everything ran well, you could. I mean, you could find that time. You would have to work a little bit harder, but the reward was, hey, I got 20 minutes to sit now and let this thing unfold, and I can read my book. So the fact that I finished my graduate studies in a factory is just ridiculous enough, but it was because I was able to manage my time. So Maxwell, speaking of time, I'm taking up yours. Please go ahead.
I was just trying to remember, there was an exhibition at the Macintosh Gallery last semester. I cannot remember the names of the artists, but they looked at meatpacking industries in the prairies, building off of research, like a auto theory kind of, that's not true. Autobiography, no, that's not true either. Based on a novel of the Chicago slaughterhouses and how there's all these strange, like politico-economic things going on that lure immigrants to the prairies to work as in factories, that lets them become citizens, and that maybe they are appreciative of this, maybe we are misunderstanding exploitation in their context. Like, it was interesting, it had its problems, but if I could remember the names, I could say more things about it, but it was at the Macintosh.
Now, what you're saying there also is one of the issues that made revolutionary practice in the 60s that much harder, because if you remember Hastings King's essay from last week, he talked about how the revolutionary potential of the working class or the proletariat was compromised by the fact that now they were able to hire people off the floor into management positions. Now suddenly you're less likely to be a revolutionary. Then you also have the working class siding with de Gaulle in the 1950s in terms of the Algerian War. And then the last one is with better wages and that elusive spare time. The spare time now was directed towards consumption, right? That spare time really wasn't spare time anymore. It was the time off to spend your money. And so the very ideas that you're discussing here in this sort of looking at the meatpacking plants, it reminds me of what was happening to the working class forces. They became simply it was a group of people now that were thinking twice about revolting. Now that was the early 60s, but by the late 60s, things had changed. But certainly that early period when de Gaulle specifically was interacting with the SB folks, this was the dilemma they were facing. How do we reactivate that revolutionary potential if we're traditional Marxists, when these very folks are given opportunities, given time off, a wage increase, automation, all the very things that were going to make revolting that much more difficult to sell as an idea. But I think too, if you're grateful for a job, you're definitely less likely to revolt because you're happy you've got something.
Yeah, and Emily's posts in the chat, Big and Lemons was the presentation. Okay. Looks like there's a link there. So this is actually quite different from what Han's looking at, which is like, this has all been very useful because it characterizes a way of thinking that Han is pushing back against, which is one of the reasons why I cannot get away from him as a thinker, that Han wants to say that we have moved from allo exploitation or exploitation of others into auto exploitation, which is very problematic because we are both exploiter and exploited of ourselves, and it makes some very problematic discourses, but it also does some very interesting things for questions that we can ask. And that's important for understanding how his thinking around time and entertainment is working, and particularly in terms of what he's contrasting this with, the passion narrative, that these passion projects were serious uses of our time or psychological, what the things we're paying attention to, religion, work, whatever. Han wants to say that today this is achievement. We are a passion project, our passion narratives is achievement, and he likes to use the example of like doping in sports, that it's not specifically winning or patriotism or sportsmanship that is the emphasis. It's the achievement of pushing boundaries, breaking records and things like that. I'm not about to back up that argument, but it's something he uses a lot that I think helps understand what he's talking about when he's saying things like the achievement society. So under that sort of societal structure, free time becomes a joke, because it's not a question of production and consumption. It's a question of like very narcissistic interests, and those interests don't have to do with money. They often do, but it's more about personal attempts to find fulfillment, which is impossible without it's impossible without an other that basically says you've done well. But in this narcissistic space that Han's very concerned with critiquing in neoliberalism, there is no other that can say you've done well. It's just you constantly at the grindstone trying to get to the next achievement, which is always metonymically deferred on to the next thing as soon as you get there, if you get there.
Is it possible to change that to a competition society? I mean, we had this illusion for years that this is a meritocracy, right? If you do the hard work, you'll be rewarded. Well, no, it's all about who you know. But the issues that you raise in the achievement society clearly bleed into that free time. You know, what will you do in your free time? Well, I'm going to tweak this. I'm going to improve this. So to me, that free time is now being used in a competitive manner to improve something, as you say, like to get the fastest runner or somebody that scores the most number of goals. I'm not a sports person, but I'm fascinated by how sports people always define a game numerically, right? Most number of goals. Penalty shot 3 seconds before the end of it. Wow. It's just numbers. Accountants should be the best sports people in the world because that's all they deal with. But a sports person, it's a number of yards run. It's a number of goals, most valuable player. No, the player that racked up the most number of points. That's competition, right? That's not, it's not a good sportsmanship award, is it? Like nobody wins a Stanley Cup because of that. What a gracious loser. No, they won the most number of things, right? The numbers added up. So I find that to be much more of a competition society because that's what people do. They root for their team and it's competitive. I hope mine wins and yours loses.
Yeah, I think Hahn talks about this in his book, The Burnout Society, and I'm not 100%. I'm going to mimic what he says. I'm also thinking of accelerationist aesthetics in the background of this, but more directly to your question, I'm wary of attaching achievement to competition because competition is a calm, it's a being with. And this is part of the worldview is that we are no longer with others. We don't even recognize them. They are just reflections of us in various fragmented states. So you could talk about competition, but it starts to push away towards something that makes me, I'm not so sure about it. It's just that being with others and that competition is there.
At the very least, an awareness of the other.
Yeah, you would need that. And it's not that I'm not trying to say that you can't talk about it. It's more that in achievement, it's just the only reason that someone else might be important in that situation is that they've been able to achieve something you haven't. So therefore it's possible. It opens your awareness to it, but that doesn't mean that you're actually competing with them. It just means that suddenly you have a new achievement to reach. Yep. It's again, it's only briefly looking out before it comes back on you. So to go back to questions about time and how entertainment changes that, just thinking about ways that time flows and stretches and contracts with different kinds of attention. I've used the picture for Ready Player One because of virtual reality and these kinds of immersive entertainment that I don't think I need to say too much about how playing board games, reading books, going for a walk, all of these have different temporal registers that do different things to time. And there we go, next slide. Yeah, okay, we're good. Sorry, I didn't save my last copy of this. So what we haven't got to yet in terms of entertainment is that Hahn wants to say we've moved away from more scientific forms of thinking, more structural, specifically Nicholas Luhmann he's critiquing, but these structural concerns with truth, not truth. Hahn wants to say that in an entertainment sort of context and in reality today, the question is between entertaining, not entertaining, and that in his own words, he says reality itself appears to be an effect of entertainment. So I'm now going to read a quote that's a little lengthy just to get at what he's talking about because it explains it to me and hopefully it will enlighten you guys to what he means as well. He says, in 1870, the young Friedrich Nietzsche wrote to his friend Erwin Rohde from Basel, "This week I've heard 3 times the divine Bach's The St. Matthew's Passion, each time with the same feeling of immeasurable wonder. Whoever has fully unlearned Christianity hears it here truthfully as a gospel. This is the music of the negation of the will, without any remembrance of asceticism. In later years, however, the enlightened Nietzsche would come to perceive in Bach's music an excess of crude Christianity, crude Germanness, and crude scholasticism. Bach may well stand at the threshold of modern music, which according to Nietzsche had conquered the church and counterpoint. But upon this threshold, Bach turns back to the Middle Ages. Whoever has fully unlearned Christianity will not regain his faith with the aid of passion music, which at most dances around the resulting vacuum with tones and feelings. God here becomes a theatrical effect, at most a sound effect or a property of counterpoint that will dissolve no sooner than the music has died away. So this quality of entertainment, reality itself appears to be an effect of entertainment, comes out of the sense that we can't get a deep sense of reality just out of, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. No, totally, I don't know what happened there. My brain just fizzled. Listening to music gives you these effects and affects and feelings, but it only entertains you for the moment. And then it doesn't give you these deeper senses of religiosity and restructures them, but it does structure something else, some sort of common experience, but not these deeper religious narratives.
I would agree with that because when you think of the way in which Bach's piece and they conjure up a certain tone, or a religiosity, we'll say. It's one of the secondary qualities of it. And that's not to say that someone who is a complete atheist could do the same thing. I think of Pasolini's film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew. Pasolini was not Christian, very much a Marxist, very much an atheist, and made such a beautiful film about the life of Christ that the Vatican awarded him an award. Okay, it kind of reminds me of Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, right? That gender is defined by these codes. Well, musically speaking, religion is now defined by codes, by certain sound qualities, by certain harmonies. And if that's the case, then the essence is just really now a bunch of sound cues, right? Or visual cues. So the truth, not truth, and reality, not reality. If I look at it from that perspective, that statement makes sense. I understand what he's saying, that it conjures up a truth, but is not the truth, or a reality without being reality itself, religious or otherwise. Is that kind of the way you're taking it?
Yeah, thanks. You just gave me enough space to remember my thoughts.
Right.
This kind of music, what Nietzsche is describing, and this Christianity is, as you say, truth, capital T, and this is part of the passion narrative. But entertainment is truth among many, and it has a more fluid kind of understanding as opposed to being some strict, solid foundation. So it starts to structure a different kind of experience. Just another quote to give a non-music example. Hans talking about stories as entertainment, and he says, stories do not argue, they attempt to please and rouse. This is the basis of their unusual effectiveness. The narrative forms of entertainment proper to mass media contribute to the stabilization of society by habituating moral norms and thereby binding them to the inclinations, to the quotidian, and to the self-evident of the it is so, which requires no supplemental judgment or reflection. This is, I think, where it really starts to step away toward a different kind of experience where entertainment does have narrative qualities. It has some sort of social fiber attached to it. In order to find something entertaining or funny, pleasurable, scary, there has to be a foundation of norms already attached to it. But these aren't things that we directly think about. And if we did, it wouldn't be entertaining. It would be something far more serious, contemplative, reflective, whatever.
Now, would you say that would fit into someone like Bertolt Brecht's idea of a distanciation, where he says, look, the narrative I'm going to dispense with, I'm going to show you how did these people get to this place, right, into this position, and is less concerned with storytelling than he is about, in fact, he dispenses with the ending often right in the beginning. And the question becomes, well, how did we get here? And so that poses a different, like a different conundrum, a different paradigm that through which you view that story. So I would say stories do not argue. Well, it depends. Humor is based almost, well, the way I teach it is based very much on an awareness of those social norms. So until you have it pointed out to you, and of course that's what luckily what students say after the fact, sir, you didn't kill my joy of laughter and humor, but you kind of opened my eyes as to how it works. And the way I did it, or the way I do, is by identifying the fact that humor is based on that disjunction between what is versus what should be, right? Those norms and expectations and traditions are informing the background of the joke, and the deviation, small as it is, to humorous effect is the joke. So stories may not argue, but stories still need to be premised on these as he says here, the stabilization of society, the moral norms. Absolutely, because otherwise, I mean, the only exception I can think of is William Burroughs. With William Burroughs' world, you step into it, and it is utterly unique and utterly, it's logically its own. But there's not that many writers that are like him or were like him. But still, those moral norms are always informing the story in the first place. Now, whether it stabilizes society, that could be a secondary effect. But it's certainly, when you look at romantic comedies, those stories, always have a clear closure. Usually, the very tail end followed by a wedding. That's typically the case. But yeah, stories do not argue. You'd have to be very specific on the kinds of stories, because certainly Brecht would have disagreed with that, say, no, they do argue. They're pedagogical. They're trying to argue a point. And the way in which he does it is by dispensing with the ending altogether. There was a film in 1985 by Agnes Varda, a Hungarian filmmaker now working in France. And the film is called Vagabond. I don't know if any of you ever saw it, but the film starts with a young woman frozen to death in a ditch. Like the camera, slowly traveling left to right, and there's just this ditch, and all of a sudden there's this woman, and we see her for a few moments. We register what we're looking at, and then the film starts. She's alive. So this wonderful Brechtian device of like, how did she get here? Like, what happened? So the narrative now functions slightly differently. It certainly does not stabilize society. It conjures up quite the opposite. How could someone slip through the cracks this way? So stories, generally speaking, but you can certainly argue that there are others that, their purposes are quite different. Brecht certainly being, I think, the most explicit example of that kind of thinking.
Yeah. So just wondering what the context is he's writing in.
Okay.
Stories not arguing is definitely more, argument for Hahn is definitely more related to logic. And I'm pretty sure here he's talking explicitly, he's in the midst of a 2-chapter rant about how Kant wants to juxtapose pleasure against morality.
Okay.
And this is the kind of tension he's talking about. And I think what you're explaining is a kind of interest in, like a history is obviously a story, histoire, and that it leads you somewhere, but this is exactly the rousing that I think Hahn's talking about, is that it leads you down somewhere, and where you start getting into questions is a different kind of psychological space than the story itself. The story sort of sets the tone, and I have more vital ground to discuss this in a minute, so I'll actually just leave that. I'm going to rush through a few of these last slides because I want to open up the space to actually have more of an open discussion. But basically, I just wanted to attach this to, obviously, it's very Baudrillard, very simulation, theories of entertainment, that entertainment has a relationship to, it subsumes the real into what is normal or banal. And it's based on, as you said, what should be, and then the slight difference from it. Whereas Hahn's general assumption is that we don't have shoulds, we have cans, we have possibilities. And that distinction is really crucial, because we just don't have that normal foundation. It's part of the anxiety and just like all of the trips and faults that we experience in contemporary culture. which is maybe a really important thing to talk about in relation to the SI, which I'm not sure would have been there yet. By Hahn's timeline, they wouldn't have been.
Mhm.
And that I also wanted to bring up Asger Jorn's Intimate Banalities, where he talks about banality as this foundational element to creativity and artistic production, that it's, we don't go out and buy the most expensive, totally just forgot the name of that instrument, the very big one, cello. We don't go out and buy a really expensive cello. We just, like Jorn talks about, listening to these crappy cellophane flutes that ended up being outlawed in wherever he was living because they were just so friggin' annoying. And he was saying these people need to open their minds because it's free expression, and this like banal everyday thing is actually the foundation of making new things, of creativity itself. So this is what I was thinking of, where I wanted to get to, is that in answer to all of these things about entertainment and questions about normativity and the kind of practices that emerge in New Babylon, and then these problems of how, even though Constance created this structure, this macro structure, in order to have these collisions of desires and interests, I'm concerned that he has completely ignored this, like how we would actually live in there, not in terms of logic, but in terms of like, how would we actually get to that? And I think this is the problem he runs into in terms of turning his vision into something real.
Mhm.
People didn't understand or appreciate what it would mean to not have personal objects or property. This was the main pushback that he received. So it's important for something like New Babylon to have that underlying narrative. As Judith was saying with Habitat 67, it's not just a building, it needs that cultural fiber to bring it together. And this is what I think about for my subtitle, Psychogravitation. It's not just a mass of objects, it's a knitting of social psychological fibers that give something a kind of weight that we all gravitate toward, much like the past elements in closed landscapes, as Chechklov was talking about. These are not, we don't gravitate towards them just because they're old. We gravitate towards them because they have some sort of narrative surrounding them that we're aware of, that's interknit with our daily life. So I think New Babylon lacks that, especially because it's so unstable as a structure. It doesn't have the foundations that it needs to narrate the meaning that's part of it. It just excavates personal property as meaning and then doesn't seem to replace it, or at least I haven't found what it replaces it with yet. But in Bernard Stiegler's philosophy, he talks about amateurism and this symbolic misery that it's responding to, or that he wants to respond to, where he thinks that we live in this industrialized society that no longer produces its own symbols. It just has a kind of top-down force feeding of mass information, mass symbols that turn all of our individual consciousnesses into these iterations of, not even iterations, copies of each other that can't create new meaning, that don't go anywhere new or exciting, can't be revolutionary because they're all the same and they're all comfortable and habituated and lame in like a deep sense. But for Stiegler, he wants to say the amateur is a lover of what they do. They're attracted to things because they really care about them. This is, I think, what underlies New Babylon in the desire, is that people do what they do. They change the space and the way they change it because they actually care. And through caring about that space, they create things, which is, for Stiegler, a process of individuation, but also trans-individuate. They make a we, or a culture, out of those individual products. And then eventually that amasses into some sort of posterity in Duchampian terms, just because we mentioned that earlier. The point here being that through my own selfish interests, I actually produce things that have cultural value, which produce culture over time.
Mhm.
This practice, I think, is, I'm actually going to skip through this mystagogy stuff because it's more confusing than anything at this point. The important thing I wanted to get to is this psychogravitation, these social fibers, how we make them, and that underneath this stuff, underneath Constance New Babylon, I'm just concerned that there isn't a way to actually make narrative, or he's sort of created this structure around it and left this huge void in the middle. And I think it's the only way I can see to make a psychogravitation, the only way I can see to make a narrative that would actually allow people to live in these spaces would be amateur practices. And this is really the question that I want to get at. I apologize for skipping through all this stuff at the end, but that is really my concern in a nutshell. And then here's another quote from Hahn that I think kind of gets at what I'm talking about and what he's talking about. He says, very bluntly, entertainment is narration. It poses a narrative suspense, a method that generates suspense and enmeshes the subject in tension, in thrills, is more effective than compulsion or duty. He's speaking directly to an achievement society and to a disciplinary society. It's neither of these things. Entertainment, that is, he wants to construct entertainment as a totally different kind of societal structure. The narrativity of myth fits into this. It's like entertainment, and it's more effective than moral imperatives and more compelling than reason and truth. So it's not just about morality and distinctions of what's good and not good, and it's not about distinctions of what's logical or sensible. It's about pleasure fundamentally. Here, I think obviously thinking of Venegam's text, Basic Banalities, and his interest in these mythic structures. So just to sort of conclude is the question that I've brought up a couple of times now, whether New Babylon has this possibility for narrative or whether it's just this macro structure and has missed not the microstructure of ambiance, which is a very personal feeling in the SI, but something that's more intersubjective. And that's what I'm looking for in my final paper when I get to it. Again, apologies for rushing that last bit, but I would bow if I was standing.
Well, when I look at psychogravitation, and I don't even know if this works, but there was actually a time, if you can imagine, in 2021, that back in the 80s, people wanted to go downtown. Why? Because that's where other people were. And you would go and you would hope to run into friends, and they were doing something. And as a result, you'd be able to, to hang out with them and, hey, let's do this, let's do that. I know it sounds like a really lame example, but can't even say, the pull, the gravitational pull of my psyche towards a certain place. That's what it made me think of when I was reading it, because now people tend to avoid certain places. So it's like a negative response rather than a positive response. I want to go there because I feel good when I'm there. I'm going to run into like-minded people there because, and I know it's hard to believe, some people I would never want to go downtown. It's a scary place, it's whatever. But there was a point in time when, because there were so many things to do, I mean, there were way more theaters, way more clubs, way more all kinds of stuff. You could leave Saturday morning at noon and may or may not come back till Sunday morning because what could happen? Now, does that make me a situationist? No. What it did make me is someone that wanted to go to a certain place because others were looking for the same sort of thing. And it wasn't cheap thrills or excitement. We'd go and hang out. That's something that, Maxwell, to your point, where we seem to do these things alone, right? Now, whether we're sitting in front of our digital audio workstation, making tunes, and then we load them up to Bandcamp, and we communicate with someone from who knows where, hoping they're not a bot, but they're an actual listener, et cetera, et cetera. It's a kind of a lonely existence. But the only time, as you pointed out, that there is any kind of competitive notion is when, somebody else does better. And what's so sad is we have the spare time where we pursue a passion, and all of a sudden we have, every once in a while, we have a success story. Justin Bieber just around the corner from living in Stratford, all of a sudden he's worth $1 bazillion. You guys keep at it. So does that now warp that free time? Of course. because now we're back to competition, right? We're not going like, wow, this is really cool. I'm going to keep doing my tunes because I like to do that. There, really the way in which free time has been configured relative to work time, it's either going to be broken apart and manipulated and used to our own ends, or we're going to have to devise some other version of free time because we seem to have less and less of it. And of course, as students, you don't have any of it, right? I mean, you don't have time to reflect. You're so busy reading, you're so busy just, preparing for whatever's coming up. Free time is literally a luxury. It is. Emily.
Judith, you put your hand up first. Do you want to?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, I could only see part of you. Go ahead, Judith, first.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know, but Emily, maybe you can also ask your question because maybe it's like related or one is more relevant than the other. I more just wanted Maxwell to like further explain the connection between Han's entertainment theory and the architecture we started with at the beginning, because I'm still lost on like what the thread is.
Fair enough. There's a lot of different threads, which is part of why that hasn't been more explicit. I can start so at the beginning I mentioned the cloud glass, the black mirror, and that was partially just honesty and transparency in my own process, but also because of its attachment to technology, and that I find it really interesting that this object, though different, has been around for hundreds of years, and this phenomenon of some reflective dark surface is hallucinatory and hypnotic, that we fall into it. And that New Babylon was fundamentally built on automation and being deeply integrated with contemporary technology. So I didn't really have time to talk about that. I probably should have made that a little more explicit, but these cities are not only just wacky and modular and shifting, changing, they're also like built out of technology more than not built out of technology. I would imagine that today, most of those walls would probably be screens. Like, it's that level of integration. So talking and thinking about the Black Mirror, entertainment, screen time, in New Babylon, I've been imagining it as though we would actually live in a Black Mirror in a certain way, which makes it a bit dystopic. But more explicitly, to answer your question, the connection between New Babylon and entertainment is that I see entertainment as a more practical underlying piece of New Babylon's macro structure. That New Babylon is a space we live in and implies a certain kind of value, a certain kind of way of life, but entertainment is what would actually stabilize that way of life and start imparting some sort of cultural narrative that would give that space more than just a we can and more of a this is sort of function. Does that get at your question?
Yes, but then I'm just kind of still missing the piece of like, I don't see Han's description of entertainment as functional. So I'm just wondering how it becomes something functional that we can like utilize in New Babylon.
Yeah, so this is why I included Stiegler. I realized that I brought in way too much information for something of this scale, but it's all unfortunately necessary because you have this macro structure, you have this stabilizing normative experience, and then you have amateurism as a way to generate that material, and then it feeds backwards. That on an individual level, you have amateur practice driven by passion and care for anything. Through that accumulation, you get various kinds of entertainment and what I would call consumption, but not in a Marxist sense, just like things that we pay attention to, which I've also tried to replace with the term psychogravitation. But after Ed, I'm now thinking maybe it's magnetic? Magnetivity? Magnets, psychomagnets. So there's a repulsion and attraction quality. This is some sort of thing that brings us together, and then we fit that into this living, shifting structure that is radically different from the past, that we are in many of these theorists' opinions something we shouldn't be holding on to anymore, or at least be like very careful about what we hold on to.
Emily,
makes
did you
more
want to, sorry?
Yeah, that makes more sense in terms of like the different pieces it's got.
Great. Emily or Ed?
Emily, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't know. There's so many different things that I'm thinking and wondering after hearing you speak. I mean, I think that my research is pretty interesting. And then I hear you talk about your research and I'm like, oh my God, it's just, it's very interesting. There's so many places you could go. It's really rich. I mean, if I was to kind of, the question you ended with, it seems like your research question is like whether New Babylon does or does not have meaning. Is that more or less the question?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot I was mic'd. Yes, that is essentially my question. It's pretty much always my question. Is there meaning in this?
Right.
And meaning in a very robust sense. I'm not talking about signification. I mean something like deeply interknitting, something that brings us together and connects what I'm doing to what you're doing, to where we are, to why we're here. So yeah.
I mean, it becomes a very difficult question because you're not talking about something that was realized, right? So then in your own writing, are you trying to approach meaning in a kind of projective or imagined way? Are you saying, would this have meaning if it had been realized, and what does that look like? Or are you saying, as it stands, as a possibility, as a model, is there already meaning? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, are you talking about the future or an imagining, or are you talking about the model itself? And I thought it was interesting that you said possibility doesn't have meaning. I think you said that partway through, which is maybe a different way of saying like functionality doesn't have meaning, right? Like pure function is sort of vacuous, which I think you suggested, like, is it just this giant kind of vacuous void in the sky? And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so that's something I was thinking about is like, are you talking about the projective or are you talking about the present? Like my question is, what if there's no meaning at all in it? And that's kind of where I'm leaning. I also think maybe you have to think about the word Babylon. Like it's not that interesting, but he calls it New Babylon. I think you told me that there was a different name initially for it. It was called the Derivery or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, the Derivail was originally his term for it in terms of the derivé, and then New Babylon came from De Boer. I don't know why Constant decided to go with that, but
so it's not his own term because obviously Babylon, first city, whatever. So you might think about that. And I'm also wondering, like, why is it raised? Like, why don't they just suggest, building it out somewhere on the ground? Like, there's still probably a possibility for modularity if it was built at or just above ground level. Like, why the suggestion to build it above pre-existing cities? What does that mean? And I'm also just really wondering, like, he designs the architecture, but what are the kind of like, what's the social design? Like, does the city still exist and keep existing with people going to their jobs and whatever, and then they can go up to Derivail and like fuck around and have fun and, move the structure around? Or is the city supposed to like become void? Everything that happens in the city, do people permanently live up there, or do they just go up there for fun, for leisure? Is there housing built into it, or is it purely a space to just go and, live this kind of life of entertainment? So those are the kinds of questions like, what if the social architecture, was this worked out? Was this written about? And then the only other thing I was going to say about amateurs is like, to be an amateur, do you need to also be something other than an amateur? Because to me, the radical implication of this structure is that if everybody's an amateur, having fun, moving the structure around, this kind of pure entertainment, like, can you be an amateur if you aren't something other than an amateur? Is for some reason the question to me. Like, if you have something like a profession, is amateurness defined in opposition to other kinds of work, or could you be like a pure amateur? Because what I see in New Babylon is this kind of pure amateur, this kind of, this open jouissance, this structure that moves around, which again, I don't think is actually possible at a large scale, but if it was, would you cease to be an amateur? Would you just be like a pure subject of entertainment? And then, what's that? Like, that does seem dystopian, right? So I think of being an amateur in relation to non-amateur, it feels like a relative term to me. And I just think that's something else that's interesting here.
Yeah, okay, so that was a lot. You're gonna have to keep me on track here. The amateur at root is from amore, to love, or lover. And that is the term that Stiegler, that's the way he develops that term. And it's the way that I understand the term, though Edward Said, Andy Merrifield, Roland Barthes, they talk about the amateur more in juxtaposition to professionals. In a paper that I'm working on being published right now, I've made the argument that the amateur can't exist right now, which makes thinking about it quite difficult. As soon as you have professionalism and commodities, you can't talk about love in a way that isn't immediately converted into profession as soon as it's realized. Like if I make something and you realize it's a real object, it becomes a commodity. That's just how it is. So in that frame, you can't have amateur practice without it. You can't have it actualize. It's always only a possibility. So part of thinking about this is difficult because of that. In New Babylon, it's a post-work society, so you wouldn't really have professions or professionals in its fullest realization. But I think I'm more interested in trying to understand why this project, in a sense, failed or never became anything. Whether Constant actually wanted it to be a reality, it's not entirely clear to me whether it's just an artistic expression to him or whether it was, like, it's obviously supposed to be functionally possible, but it's not clear to me that he really pushed for it being made as beyond his own making. But my question is more like, why wouldn't this catch on in a more serious way when he goes to lengths to prove that this is actually a thing that could be made? It's not just a utopian ideal. And to me, the answer to that is it lacks that narrativity or meaning that makes it something we could actually live in as people, real people, and not just bodies that move around and function on some like weird desirous plane that I just don't think is legitimate. Like, it's a romantic idea. It's not a real idea. I think I've actually just shorthanded a bunch of your questions. Can you put me back on track?
No, I mean, yeah, I think that's great. So what is supposed to happen to the rest of the city? Like New Babylon is supposed to be built above Paris. Is that correct? What happens to the rest of Paris? Like, do people just stop going there? Do they go there sometimes?
Yeah, so as far as I understand, New Babylon's just suspended above it. I'm not clear on what kind of maintenance is done on the city. They do go down to work sometimes. It's sometimes talked about in that way, but it isn't. The city itself is premised on full automation. It's premised on no more work. It's premised on the ground level being for travel, maybe social meetings, factories that are presumably fully automated. But in a transitional period, it would make sense that you would still go down to work. And in answer to your question about what the above structure is, yes, you do live there, and that's part of the problem for other people in the reception. They don't quite understand how, for example, like, how do you feel security and comfort if you can't reliably return to the same space in any kind of sense? This was part of the pushback, and a lot of people tried to kind of halfway this project, and it created a whole bunch of other architectural visions, utopias, dreams, models, whatever. So the landscape, the cityscape does survive, though for how long, I'm not sure. My focus would probably be in that transitory space between what we are now and what he's thinking about. But your question, I would situate in like a distant future of whether those, like, are those just abandoned buildings that we now treat as like fun places to go derive and do psychogeography, or are they still functionally relevant? And given what I understand of Constance's state of mind, I would say they're not relevant anymore, and they would just fall into ruin. In fact, underneath a lot of his models, actually I won't say a lot, underneath some of his models are ruins. It's not clear to me what those ruins are of. Also keeping in mind, this is post-World War II. The world that he's living in is going to be radically different than the world we live in right now. So yeah, I sort of half answered a lot of your questions there.
So would there be any nature in New Babylon? Would there be gardens, or would it just be plastic?
I think the underground this is a serious problem as far as I can tell. Ed might be able to speak to it better, but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of nature in Constant's imagining. It's all very artificial materials like plastics, metals, and the fact that these are suspended cities, I just cannot imagine how plant life could grow underneath. It doesn't seem to be a concern for him, though feasibly it could be on top. Like these are basically supposed to go from, we have one horizon line that's obscured by our closed landscapes of urban space, to we have, I don't know, like 10 horizon lines of different strata of urban space, and then the top one could be soiled. I don't know. So, Ed, do you know anything more about that?
Actually is a very good question, because Emily, to your point about where does nature exist in this world, one thing that is that's been pointed out is the constant return to nature, to incorporate nature into design, and clearly in this case that's not happening. And I wonder if it was Constant's desire to push so much further into the future, because the hindsight we have now is we're looking at this from 2021. He was doing this in the mid-50s, when this is literally the future, which is a terrifying prospect. So suddenly they start putting their thinking caps on and go, okay, what would be something that would be better? Well, we need to have, modular cities. We need to keep that surrealist, shock and surprise aspect to architecture. How that's done, I don't know. But the ideas that we have to remember is these are happening not long after the Second World War. Rebuilding is in earnest, but the notion of nature seems to be not at this early point as important as it becomes later, as we move into this postmodern phase, not just in architecture, but in general, sort of a return to nature. And the fact that is this part of this long narrative of our fall from grace, right? Fall from the Garden of Eden, that we need to keep that little piece. It seems at this point, Constant wasn't as concerned about it, because he wished to look to the future. And perhaps a return to nature was maybe part of that false narrative that got them into war in the first place. I'm not sure that, I don't have explicit information, but it is a valid position to take. Like, what happened to nature? Where is it? Because there's discussion about different forms of concrete, different forms of steel and metal that can be formed and twisted every which way. Sure. But the issue of nature seems to be much less of concern than it becomes 20, 30 years later. And I wonder if that's what it may have been. Seeing how the ugliness of high modernism, and then wondering, okay, we need to move away from that. I don't want to live in a square block that looks like a prison. I want to have, circles. I want to have, triangular shapes, everything other than a box. But it seemed like the issue of nature kind of got sort of set aside temporarily. But surprise, surprise, because we're storytellers, we start thinking, we're looking backwards, and it gets reintroduced. Maxwell, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think this goes back to Judith's question earlier about SoulKnit and nature and how this all fits in. Again, like, this feels like a transitory moment between modern urbanism and postmodern kind of systems thinking. Is Constant starting to get integrated into larger systems, but that system is not a ecology in the way that we tend to approach it now. And in response to Peter's comment in the chat, nature here was definitely referring more to like organic, as opposed to plastic and metals, these things that I think we can shorthand in this discussion, not in terms of like what's natural for humans, but what pre-exists humans and sustains things beyond humanism, which is also why Venegam's floating in the background of this, and his hate on for humanist discourses, I think is quite important here.
Which would include this return to nature.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good time to end. This has been a great discussion. We've thrown in lots of SI stuff and sort of, connected the dots, and hopefully, Maxwell, this discussion might help you to kind of clarify these thoughts and these links between entertainment and architecture and potentialities versus, realities. Because as we can see, we've spent almost 2 hours discussing what we thought was a simple idea, but once we kind of look at it from different perspectives, it does, it does raise many more questions than it answers. And that's not a default of your research. It's an extraordinarily rich topic that you've taken, because architecture, occupying space and then its temporal qualities, our relationship to it, whereas nature, etc., all that whole ball of wax is part of that general perspective that you're taking. So fantastic class. Very quickly, just to remind everyone what we have left, March 25th, Payoshini will present Alienation and the Spectacle. April 1st, we have a double feature with Helen presenting psychogeography and the gendered body. And then Judith, you're working on language in the SI. Again, a lot of rich material. And then on the 8th, Emily will be presenting thoughts on anarchy in the SI, or perhaps just anarchy in and of itself. So that's what we have left. We have 3 weeks left. Wow, we're zipping through this. Okay, so we're going to say bye now because I have a class in 5 minutes, luckily on this same computer. So take care, everyone, and we will see each other. Cool hand there. We'll see each other very soon, and take care. We'll talk to each other next Thursday. Bye.
Bye.